Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
If UFOs are from outer space, what would their planets be like? If all possible worlds exist in the multiverse and they often overlap, why doesn't Godzilla come through and eat New York? Or Woonsocket, for that matter. Why do some people hang around after death and some don't?
Hello, and welcome to the 928th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, coming to you from WOON, AM and FM radio in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, on the Paranormal Radio app, from TalkStream Live, on YouTube and via TuneIn.com. I'm Ben, and those many questions came from my co-host, partner in Paranormal Adventures, and Dad, Paul. And today we bring you an open line show, the second, with a new guest co-host.
Peter William Shelley joins us today. Peter has been known to our regular listeners for years as the mysterious Peter from South America, who sends in excellent questions every week. A native of San Jose, California, Peter has had an active interest in UFOs and the paranormal since the 1960s. After attending film school, he worked in cartoon animation as an artist. Ultimately, he was employed at Hanna-Barbera Studios. In 2020, Peter started his own podcast on YouTube, Shadowy Spectrums. He specializes in interviewing researchers from outside the United States. He lives in Bogota, Colombia, where he has taught English for over 10 years.
So, Peter William Shelley, welcome back to Behind the Paranormal.
Well, thank you, Paul and Ben. It's a pleasure to be back, and I'm excited about our discussion. Thank you.
So let's begin with, I'm moving this to the front because it's an active case. Phil from the Connecticut, the Litchfield Triangle, as we call it, has sent in some very interesting information here. Phil is a show reporter and is one of our spies in that area.
Yes, and our spy reports to us. Hi, Paul. There have been some seemingly paranormal events lately in the Litchfield-Torrington area. Of course, what else is new, he has in parentheses. Personally, I was on my way to work when I saw myself hitchhiking. I, quote-unquote, was wearing exactly what I had on in the car, blue winter parka, brown wool hat, black boots. Based on your experience, what would have happened if I stopped to give myself a ride? It makes me think about the Vermont surveyors, which we were talking about last week, and what would have happened if they knocked on the door of that old farmhouse?
Okay, well, two questions there. They're really very good questions. We've run into doppelgangers before, at least in my experience, where people see themselves. We had a listener who wrote in that she had walked into her own kitchen and seen herself sitting at the island or the counter with the countertop in the middle of the kitchen. What would have happened if he picked himself up? I think what would have happened, just from having heard about these things before, now experience, I've never picked myself up hitchhiking, and I only would hitchhike in Canada about 100 years ago, right? And I made some good friends that way, actually. But I think that you might, Phil, have disappeared before you opened the door, or the other person might not have. But you never know. I mean, it's possible you might have had a conversation with yourself, although that is very rare in my files anyway. Ben?
That's a good question. I honestly don't know.
You never picked yourself up hitchhiking?
No. I know myself well enough to not do that. I'm not sure. I think it makes me wonder if that version of yourself would even speak the same language. I don't know. There's so many variables that
there are
that it's like I couldn't confidently give an answer. And I feel like that's the problem. Most paranormal things, I have a hard time giving a confident answer.
I would have tried to do it. I'm crazy that way. Peter, what say you?
Meeting a doppelganger? That reminds me of a classic Twilight Zone episode where that does happen. There's a woman waiting in a bus station, and she sees someone who's an exact duplicate. And nobody else seems to be aware of this other woman. and she gets more and more paranoid, and finally the doppelganger takes her place, replaces her on a bus trip. I can't say. I don't know what would happen.
Well, maybe I wouldn't pick it up in that case.
But I have seen people that looked very similar to me at a distance, and I have wondered, but I don't know what would happen.
Yeah, it's difficult to say. On his second question, which regards the case we were talking about last week, first of all, Phil, the area he reports on for us is the Litchfield Triangle in Connecticut, as we call it. It's not really a triangle. It's about 330 square miles at this point, out over into the Hudson Valley of New York. And it's a flap area, as we call it. All sorts of goofy things happen there all the time, and apparently always have. And we have all kinds of bizarre eyewitness stories, military presence, which in our opinion is based at a farm where there's no farming, and there's all sorts of bizarre activity going on. So we've talked about that on many shows, and we have it in a couple of our books. So that's what that's about. But the case in Vermont that Phil refers to was in 1975, and I was there and sort of recovering from the Bridgeport poltergeist activities of the previous November. And these surveyors came to my friend's house where I was staying and told me about this bizarre apparent time slip or slip in space that they had while surveying a large tract of land for a farmer. And they had come upon a house that wasn't there the next time that and there was a bizarre fellow with an axe over his shoulder came around. So what would have happened had they crossed over the stone wall and knocked on the door? Well, the house may have disappeared before they did that. I don't know if I would approach the place with the guy with the axe there. He did not seem to see them. He, as they described it, seemed to kind of look around as if he felt some sort of presence, but couldn't quite see or hear them, which is a classic expression of a multiversal overlap in my experience. And the house was very old. It looked as though it had not been painted. Had no wires running to it, no cars in the yard, nothing modern about it. So they might have disappeared. I mean, it's also possible. There was a case in England, in Devon, in the 19th century that was no reason to believe that it didn't happen, because I talked to people who descended from the person to whom it happened, and the story passed down in their family. They were the person was visiting a cottage that she'd never seen before. Maybe she was riding her bicycle. This is in the 1890s, and stopped because of a rainstorm, and knocked on the door. And a funny little guy let her in, and she sat down. And there was a bird. She'd never seen this kind of bird in a cage, but there was absolutely no sound whatsoever. The man was very kind. He seemed as though he was speaking, but she didn't hear him. And as soon as the rain stopped, she left. But it was very pleasant, at the same time very kind of creepy. It's like things that are really bizarre but strangely funny in a way. So she always remembered that. And next time she came by, the cottage was broken down and didn't look anything like it had when she was there. So, which had been a few days before. So these things do happen, and there were all sorts of things in our files about this. So as far as the farmers, the surveyors, I don't know. I have to give you the same answer we all gave on the previous hitchhiker question, Phil. Ben or Peter, any further thoughts on that?
Peter, how about you?
Well, I kind of flashed on the Harry Martindale case that we talked about a while back. That's the one in Yorkshire, England, where a guy was working in a cellar, and all of a sudden a whole column of Roman soldiers comes marching into the room and out, and he thought that he huddled in the corner, and his impression was they would kill him if they were aware of him, and for some reason they were not aware. They appeared not as phantasms, but as real flesh and blood. Roman soldiers, and he thought he was going to be killed.
Yeah.
But he just kept his mouth shut, and they didn't, for some reason, even being so close, they weren't aware of him.
Well, to them, he might have been a ghost, as we would call it, because they might hear him, they might not. And he was not the only witness to that sort of phenomenon in that place. There's another case where people saw seemingly the same or similar soldiers marching through there, and to us, a classic time slip. This would be the question about whether we would ask, if they're the spirits of dead people, why would they be wearing clothes? Why would they be carrying swords, things of this kind? And rather, the time slip thing is more logical to us anyway. So there we have it. So, Peter, you had a case of your own, or some questions of your own you wanted to introduce, and it's only right, because your questions are on every show, and we look forward to them. So go ahead.
Well, thank you. I recently was looking into something called the Doddleston Messages. This is a case which happened in England, in a village called Doddleston, near the Welsh border, south of Liverpool. And in 1984, this case has started involving, a guy named Ken, a economics teacher at a local school, and his girlfriend and another friend. They were living at a cottage in this little village, and they claim they started to experience phenomena. For example, at one point they noticed small footprints on their walls with 6 toes. And this was while they were renovating the cottage. And this phenomena supposedly continued and evolved into kind of a poltergeist effects, maybe like kitchen items being found, stacked up, pots and pans and kitchen items in towers, and this continued, this weird phenomena. And then Ken brought home a computer from his school to use on the weekend, a BBC Micro. And of course, this was before the internet, very primitive home computer. And he claimed he started to get messages on this computer. And ultimately messages from a individual which appeared to be from another time period, kind of speaking in a Shakespearean style English, and of course this continued. There were many messages, and the idea was suspected that there might be someone breaking into the house and writing on the computer, because there was no internet that they could connect with. How could these messages be occurring? Now this got even stranger, because it evolved to the point where there were messages from not only from a person who claimed to be living at the time of Henry VIII in 1521 in England. Then they started to get messages from a supposedly future source, calling itself 2109. And it's like a soap opera. There was, and at one point they asked the Society for Psychical Research in England to get involved, to investigate. And at one point, this 2109 entity, whatever it was, asked them to contact a UFO researcher in Wales. And they specified his name, and he got involved. So I'm curious what your opinion is. I can't imagine that it could be anything other than a hoax. There's just so many questions, and of course, the messages seem to appear when they were returning home. They'd be out for the day, coming home at night, and the message would be on the computer. So there was no modem involved. So now this guy was checking out the computer on the weekends and returning it during the week. So I guess that's an opportunity for someone to. But I wanted to ask you, when you were in the Coast Guard, was I believe in the 80s.
Yes.
And I imagine you had computers on the ship, and this was pre-internet. Your computers on the ship would receive messages via radio. Would that be correct?
Well, yes, that wasn't what I was doing, but I know that in the we tended to have wangs at the time. I guess every time, when I was in the service, every time I got on an airplane or in a boat or in an elevator, I thought this was built by the lowest bidder, and that was the first. I don't know. And the same thing with the computers. As you say, they were very primitive. There was this classified radio equipment there that I can't discuss and things of that kind, because now would be, primitive. But still, one has the security oath that you abide by that. But but you're right, Peter. The computers were very primitive. They were essentially word processors, and there were storage units, and you had to use floppy disks and things of this kind. And a lot of them didn't even have hard drives. So I'm not familiar with the bureaucratic machinations of the Coast Guard at the time, but I know the yeomen on the ship had computers of that kind, and the military communications were sort of on a different level. But regarding this case, Ben, you look like you have something to say about it.
Oh, I remember.
Yeah, we've looked into that.
Yeah, I as soon as you started talking about it, Peter, I was like, oh yeah, because I was like, why does it sound so familiar, Doddleston? And I was like, oh, that's right, yeah, the teacher who had the messages on his computer. And I remember when we talked about the case, I don't remember if we had a guest on. It might have just been an open line show that we talked about.
I think it was an open line show. People were asking about it.
Yeah. Although I maybe I saw a documentary about it at some point. I don't know, but I do remember.
It's out there.
I do remember watching it or reading something about it and being like, okay, well, I guess the logic would be if EVPs are a thing. What about typing stuff? But I don't know. It does. There's a lot of things in there where it's like, yeah, there's such a high margin for hoaxing.
Yeah, I'm suspicious about something.
Yeah, it's like there's any number of opportunities someone could get in there to just mess with an old couple. And
well, on the other hand, you've got the non-electronic phenomena that Peter described. The weird footsteps and things.
That is true.
And this is there actually is a theory out there that parasites, as we would call them, are learning to use computers, phones, and there are old stories from the 40s, starting really in the 30s, where people would get phone calls from people who said they were their dead loved ones, things of this kind. So
Indrid Cold.
Yeah, the whole Indrid Cold thing. I mean, if that supposedly actually happened, we've had the Tanya Durenberger, that was her maiden name, the daughter of Woody Durenberger, to whom that whole Indrid Cold thing happened, supposedly on the show many times in their books about that, and a lot of those were electronic phenomena. John Keel, who investigated the Mothman case, he was a New York journalist in the 1960s and investigated the whole Mothman thing in the Ohio Valley, said he would go home to his apartment in New York and there'd be these weird electronic sounds that come over the telephone. And also a lot of people in the area of the Ohio Valley had that happen as well. But, who knows? But as far as this case in England, it's entirely possible. I suppose something could could communicate over the computer, I guess. Words would appear, but my question would be how?
Right. Well, then there's the other question of, if one of the things with the paranormal is that, a lot of stuff isn't repeatable, but you do find patterns and similar things that kind of happen in a lot of different cases.
Yeah.
So footprints, okay, we can say, so we've seen that in other cases. Okay, so there might be something here. But like messages popping up on computers, I don't know. I've never heard that any other time.
That was my question regarding EVPs, because we had Phil Imbrogno on the show, who fell into disrepute later on because he said he went to Stanford and he didn't. But, who would do that? I mean, you can check that. So anyway.
Well, he did.
He would say that it was an AM signal coming in over the electronic voice phenomenon, whatever was going on, and that was how that would work. Supposedly the spirit voices or the voices of dead people or whatever, that's what EVPs are supposed to be about.
Well, it's funny. Immediately after that show, our kind and benevolent station manager came down and he was like, what you're doing right now is amplitude modulation. This is
we learned all about it. I learned all about it. You studied it in college, but...
Well, kind of. So it was a portion of my study, yes.
Yeah. But in any case, and my question to Phil was, does that mean that whatever's doing the voices has an AM transmitter on their side of the whatever, And that was one of our CBS shows, and we had a hard break, and he got cut off, so I never got my answer, to that. So I don't know. I mean, it's just I have my suspicions about that case, Peter, and not having been there. I just don't. I would have been too young anyway. I just don't. I was doing other things at the time. So I don't know. So I'm afraid we'll have to put a question mark on that one as well.
Can I add something?
Please.
Yeah, my impression is that maybe it was inspired by the Umo Affair in Spain.
Oh.
And which started in the 60s, and which basically involved people receiving messages in the form of postal letters and also telephone calls from a supposedly extraterrestrial source. Later, it was discovered and it was confessed as a hoax by Horton Pina in Spain. And he was a science teacher, and these communications, these letters, postal letters that were going to VIPs in Spain and Europe, were all full of all kinds of pseudo-scientific information. And even to this day, there are people who are convinced that it's real. But I'm thinking that maybe it was inspired by that. It's very, very similar. Now, here's the strange thing. I just communicated the other day with Gary Rowe, if I'm pronouncing his name right, Raoul Rowe, who was the UFO investigator that was involved. And to this day, he is still cryptic about that case. He says there are things...
Oh, he just froze up there. Okay, we'll wait till Peter unfreezes there. And no, but these are good points. I mean, these are, especially today, they're very easy to hoax, and I do have my suspicions about them. There are many cases where people are doing various copycat sort of responses to some of these cases, and really do have to worry about that. So we have, I guess we can move on to some of our listener questions here. And we have, Ben is trying to get our guest co-host back there. And we have Leanne in Creston, Iowa. And Leanne asks, or makes the comment, in reading UFO books and hearing TV shows and lectures, I hear all about what aliens do and how they do it, what they fly in and all that, but very little about where they come from except outer space. There seems to be very little talk about what their planets or societies are like. What do you guys think? Well, I wish we had Mark D'Antonio with us. Mark is one of our guest co-hosts and a dear friend, and he's an actual astronomer. And one of his specialties is exoplanets, planets that are outside of our solar system. But I think Leanne asks a good question. What are these? Where do these people come from? What are they like? If that's really what they are. We have a lot of caveats when it comes to aliens. Many of my experiences with parasites, or demons as folklore calls them, are that they're, you get the feeling they're alien creatures. Now, alien in a very broad sense doesn't necessarily mean they're from other planets. Although, what does that even mean if this multiverse idea is correct, that you have parallel worlds, versions, many versions of Earth, many versions of whatever exoplanets there are, sort of out to infinity. And one of our questions was, it has been on the show, can infinity get bigger? And I think it can, because of the physics involved. But the point being that whatever societies, if these really are what they appear to be, if they really are aliens from some other world, what would their societies be like? Now, according to some experiencers, people who claim to be contactees, as they used to be called, they have been told, supposedly, about various societies, and they do tend to reflect human understanding of society. In other words, Indrid Cold, whom we mentioned in connection with the previous question, if you've seen the movie The Mothman Prophecies, there was the character of Indrid Cold, whom you never see. But during the Mothman affair of the 1960s in the Ohio Valley of the United States, there were contacts with someone who claimed that his name was Indrid Cold. He was from a planet called Lanulos, and according to Tanya Durenberger, the daughter of the man who experienced this, Woody Durenberger, the Indrid Cold came to their house one time with a companion, also from Lanulos. And the first encounter with Indrid Cold by Woody Durenberger was on a highway over on the Ohio side of the river, and he encountered a craft landed in the middle of the highway, and the guy got out, said his name was Indrid Cold, and started talking. He kind of looked like a normal human. So, I mean, if these things really happened, it seems that some of the societies are very similar to ours. He said that naturally they'll come down and say, well, we don't have any war, we don't have any sickness. It's like a sort of a heavenly planet, and that in itself makes me suspicious. So. Other more alien creatures have supposedly made contact with people and said they have various societies that are also very sort of ideal or utopian. Most others, as bad as it gets, is pretty much that they may have conflicts with other races.
Is Peter back, by the way?
Oh, hi, Peter, you're back. As long as you weren't abducted.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So we moved on to a question here from Leon. I don't know if you heard it.
We should probably go to our break at some point.
Oh, we should. I'm sorry. I'm love of the sound of my own voice. we're going to take our mid-show break here. It's Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM, 99.5 FM in New England's beautiful Blackstone River Valley. We'll be right back.
The night is alive. Join us and take a walk on the weird side when you tune in to The Kingdom of Nye, hosted by Heather Wade, the finest in late night talk. Listen live free weeknights starting at 9 p.m. Pacific time at thekingdomofnye.com, talkstreamlive.com, and the Paranormal Radio app. Wanna take a ride?
Local and live at 99.5 FM.
Okay, welcome back to Behind the Paranormal on WON AM and FM. And we're dealing with a question from Leanne in Creston, Iowa, who want to know about what alien civilizations might be like, as opposed to just what they fly around and that sort of thing. Either you fellows have any inside information on that?
Well, Peter, you were unjustly kicked off by the gods of the Internet, so please, take it away.
What extraterrestrials, civilizations might be like? That's a big question. Well, I have a couple of thoughts. Why would they necessarily be living on a natural planet? Maybe they could live on an entirely artificial world.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thought. Another thought is if we look at the planet Mars, superficially, we see a desert, and we imagine that it's totally desolate, although, water has been discovered, so we have suspicions of life. But imagine a totally desolate world. That could be an excellent location for an extraterrestrial civilization because it could be camouflage. Why would extraterrestrials necessarily want to be obvious? Wouldn't it be better to live on a planet that appeared totally desolate without life? And then you would have more security that way. I don't know. That's a thought.
Yeah, it is a thought. And, of course, on that planet, we're the aliens, and we have all our little probes running around and little helicopters flying. Probably scare them to death. I don't know. These are all questions that have yet to be answered. Leanne has a second question, Ben, if you do the honors.
Sure. Leanne has her follow-up question is, I have another question, if that's okay. I'm creeped out by all these flying humanoids that have been seen lately. What do you think they are, and have you ever seen one yourselves?
Well, I'll start that. I've seen weird things in the sky, but I don't know if they were any kind of flying humanoids. I suspect a lot of them are balloons. It's very easy to hoax that. Now, I'm going to. What do you think, Ben? Because then I want to hear what Peter has to say. Because a lot of them are seen down in his neck of the woods, up through Mexico, and
That's
into
true.
the southwestern U.S. So, what do you think, Ben?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's anything new. It's been around for a while. I think for whatever reason, I do remember seeing a few reports that sort of ended up in the mainstream news over the last summer, and they tried real hard to hoax it, or not hoax it, tried real hard to debunk it, and it's just, they're just like, oh, it's someone with a jetpack, and it's like, I don't know.
Those aren't that easy to get or to fly.
No.
Although there is a new one, and that is being used in the UK by some of the rescue personnel. If somebody breaks their leg on the side of a mountain and they can't get to it with an ambulance, they'll at least fly up some first aid. And it's really very remarkable. And they work very well. I'd love to get a hold of one myself. Just before we turn it over to Peter, there were reports, and I'll have to look into it more fully, of a flying humanoid seen over Woonsocket, Rhode Island here.
Really?
Some years ago, yes. This is what you grew up here. You know how weird this area can be.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, the UFOs particularly, and that hill that we live on. Good grief.
True.
A lot of strange things. So, Peter, what do you think about flying humanoids?
Well, that intrigues me as well. I don't. Now, one thing that's mysterious, I believe in the Mothman prophecies, the Mothman case in the 60s. Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't the movement of the Mothman a little bit strange? It wasn't exactly like a bird. It seemed to have the ability to fly without the too much movement of the wings.
I believe that's correct, yes. From what witnesses have told us.
Yeah, that's obviously an odd detail. How there seemed to be maybe some other source of power for its flying ability. I'm intrigued like everyone on this, but of course, as you mentioned now with the jetpacks and so forth, how do we know what's really happening? And I think there's so many videos that are fake now and questionable. I think the only hope is direct observation, and even then you could identify things. But I would continue to be interested as well in flying humanoids. I would like to see one.
Well, recently there was one over Los Angeles, and they somehow enhanced the photo when it turned out to be a balloon of the Jack Skellington character from Nightmare Before Christmas.
Yes.
Appropriate, I suppose, but nevertheless, there's also Peter brings up an extremely interesting point about Mothman, though, not flapping the wings, it's just sort of flying.
Yeah.
That might tie into the self-luminous red eyes that are universally reported.
Oh, and without a sound either, he would just kind of lift off the ground.
Right.
Yeah.
And with the eyes thing, there was some speculation about whether this was a machine of some kind, which would explain a number of the events, I suppose.
It's almost reminiscent of the Flatwoods Monster as well.
Yes, yeah, that's true. That we did a show on the Flatwoods Monster. Now,
did.
Flatwoods is in West Virginia too, not very far from this. And West Virginia is like Woonsocket. It must be the W. A lot of really strange events. And the Flatwoods Monster of 1955, there was UFO sightings, and Frank Vicino was on the show, and he really researched that book this thick. They were coming in over the Atlantic Ocean, UFO reports that very night, flying over Washington and other areas, not well reported. And then all of a sudden, here you have in West Virginia, one of them seemed to have crashed. His theory was that they were trying to stage a rescue or whatever this was. And the Flatwoods Monster, so-called, resulted, Flatwoods being that section of West Virginia. And a woman and some children went up, and they saw, it's depicted today almost like a tall figure in a dress, almost a maternal sort of figure. But his theory, and he has a different art concept of it, was that it was a flying platform with a rather non-attractive monster kind of alien running it, just would crashed. So, but who knows? You know, especially at such distance in history. So,
true.
Again, I'm afraid we have to put a question mark here with flying humanoids. Could be anything. Could be nothing. So anyway, here's a question from Carrie, right in our listening area in North Smithfield, Rhode Island.
Indeed, and Carrie writes to us, I have read your books, and I think the flap area idea makes a lot of sense. But if these parallel worlds are overlapping in flap areas, do the things and creatures people see come from the same parallel world? If not, is there any way to tell how many worlds are involved in the flap area? Also, does your world intersect with theirs so that dogs, cats, and people are freaking out the people that live there?
Well, anything is possible in the multiverse, if these theories are correct. I mean, would in flap areas such as the Ohio Valley or the Litchfield vicinity in Connecticut, would creatures come through from different worlds who know each other and would have fist fights over the check at dinner? I don't know. It sounds goofy, but who knows? Or that their races don't get along or had wars in the past or something. I don't know. Anything is possible. But that kind of goes through another question that we had. How come Godzilla doesn't come through and eat New York? Well, in some parallel world, if you can conceive of it, then if these theories are true, then it is happening somewhere or someone in the multiverse. But there seem to be certain limits within world families, and those are parallel worlds with very similar laws of physics, where we might feel at home. I think we pass through perhaps even millions of these every day in one form or another, and Godzilla does not seem to be part of our world family, fortunately. Unfortunately, COVID-19 does, so there's always something, So I think that it's possible that I think that there is certainly interaction all the time. We see it in the paranormal. I think that's what explains the paranormal, even psychic abilities. But as far as a total knockdown, drag-out, free-for-all coming and going, that doesn't seem to be as easy to do as would be thought of in Godzilla eating New York, something like that. So I don't know. Maybe that's all. What do you feel, Ben? What do you think?
Well, I think that I guess there's. I mean, just as how do we know how many worlds there are? Well, we don't. How do we know where
infinity can get bigger, in my opinion.
Right. Well, Yes. So the answer to your question is we don't know where, how many worlds are involved, what worlds are involved, who's there, why they're there. The most that we do know is something is happening. And whatever that something is kind of beholden to, well, the eye of the beholder. It's, we're all sort of subject to the experience of it, and there's an objective reality, and we're seeing it, and we're perceiving it, and that perception is filtered through all, our experience, which is incredibly flawed, and we really only have so much data to work with to be able to interpret it. And it's a shockingly small amount of data that we have, but we still have it to work with, and it's not much, but we do know that something's happening, right? And what we do know is that there have been sort of occurrences where there have been adverse reactions from whatever phenomena is happening to people in the room, suggesting that they're as freaked out as you are.
Yep, seen it.
So it's right. So it's we know that these things are happening, why they're happening, and how many things are happening. We don't really know. All we have is the experiences that we have in the space itself, which the space is infinite, and the experiences we have are dependent on who's involved.
Yeah.
So the answer is I don't know, but the answer that I can give you is we know that something is happening.
Yeah. Well, before I turn it over to Peter, just one more thought. I've always wondered what about the transmission of diseases or microbes across world boundaries.
The War of the Worlds.
I mean, much has been made of the Europeans arriving in America and decimating the population. It happened here in New England. But my question is, why weren't the Europeans decimated by things that the natives were immune to, but they weren't? I don't know. I've never heard an answer to that. But the question is, a lot of strange things can come over the world boundaries, like whatever paranormal thing you want to mention, but is it possible to have microbes as well? I don't know. Peter, what do you think of all this? I don't even know if you subscribe to those theories.
Well, I don't know. I'm searching for answers. I'm just as interested as everyone else. As far, my specialty is more the UFO phenomena. I know that that's real from the experience that I've described that I had as a child. Now, here's a thought that I was thinking about recently is, we've talked a lot about time slips, which are fascinating. Why couldn't Bigfoot, for example, be a time slip? In other words, we're seeing maybe some prehistoric version of man in a time slip. I don't hear people talking about that possibility.
No, you're right.
Of course, the frequency of Bigfoot sightings seems to be go against that idea. And then I don't know, is that a possibility? That Bigfoot could be a time slip?
Well, in my Bigfoot encounter in Pennsylvania in 2016, it was there very clearly, very tall, looking as if its head bowed, and then people laugh at this, but my wife called, and the theme from Lord of the Rings maybe goes blasting out over the field, and it was gone. And I blame my wife for ruining the sighting, but that's the bizarre life of the Eno family. But it came and it went. And as we've often pointed out, that this is not a wilderness area. Practically everybody has seen. We have 35 people at our neighborhood meetings, and almost all of them have seen Bigfoot and strange lights in the sky. And they're curious about relationships between UFOs and Bigfoot, all this sort of thing. But it's so normal. The local radio station refers to Bigfoot country, and the restaurants have, where we spoke particularly, had Bigfoot themes, and it's a thing. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, things will tend to come and go. So and I think I don't know, we're not providing an awful lot of answers to our listeners today with all these questions, but we'll do the best we can.
Well, we're asking more questions, provoking more thought.
Now, we have a couple of long ones here. I think we might want to go to a shorter one. This is from Maya in Lyon, France.
But we know the rule with short questions. They always lead to long answers.
They do.
So Maya writes, I am new to your show, and I love your thoughts on the paranormal. You talk about the liquid nature of the multiverse and how things and people can come and go from one to another in flap areas. My question is, in such a creation, what is the relation between ghosts and demons and parasites? Can they interact with each other, and how? Can those who die be attacked by demons, and what does hell mean?
Well, there's a lot there.
See,
that wasn't the shortest.
I told you, it's the rule. Anytime there's a short question, it's always
we can always start and go back to it if we can't finish. I think that really dovetails with what we've been saying about whether things coming and going and all this, and whether they can pick on each other. I'm thinking of a case, and I mentioned it before in the year in 2004. You had not, you were still a lad, had not joined me yet till the following year. King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, right outside Philadelphia, and there was a lady, there were two girls who were students, rooming together, and they were being bothered by what was clearly to me a parasite, but also by, what they called ghosts in the apartment. And the rest of the place, it was we would call here a 3-decker, and it was, or a house, multifamily house of the old style, and they were the only ones occupying it. However, I did find what I believed was a very negative event going on in the yard in a parallel reality. And the parasite, just like we found in Vermont that time, Ben, the parasite, when it couldn't get enough to eat from that, it would come and bothered the guy in the apartment in the adjoining house. It was very similar to this. This parasite would go in. It would get them all wound up by pushing buttons, as they do. But at the same time, I found, in my opinion, that it was also feeding on the so-called ghosts who were also present there in a third parallel reality. Who thought that we were ghosts, that the girls were ghosts haunting them. So, I mean, you had all kinds of give and take here, and you're trying to disentangle. And I've seen cases with more than 2 or 3 worlds involved, 4 or 5 in some cases, and it's a mess to disentangle. Trying to communicate. But we did manage to do it in this case, and the parasite apparently headed for greener pastures, and that was what it was. But the parasite was also bothering the quote unquote ghosts, who were actually people living occupying the same space in a parallel reality. So I mean, it gets really complicated here at times. So if that's what Maya is talking about, that does happen. So the demons, if you want to call parasites demons, picking on ghosts, are actually people. I've seen it. And can they interact with each other? Yeah, the parasites have about 9 different species. I don't know if they're all from the same origin or not. I don't think so. Some dominate others. They seem to have a society of some kind. That case in Burrillville, in Rhode Island, the one where you were working with the shaman,
Yes.
Yeah, that was a long-running case. A lot of interesting things happened, and you really had to train the people to cut off the food supply by bringing in positive energy. And there was one parasite dominating one of a lesser species, and they would both hide out in that barn, and one jumped out and attacked your mentor that time. You weren't there, but there were claw marks all over his back, that sort of thing. So, there's all kinds of interaction. What you do is to keep your own life positive. You keep your loved ones close. You keep humor in your life, and keep it positive. Keep your faith. Keep whatever is positive, and these things are not going to be drawn to you. It's like, when you go out in your yard, don't put, honey all over your arm, and the bees and mosquitoes will stay away from you, that sort of thing. It's really quite similar. So I don't know. What do you fellas think?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's again, short questions. Always really long. I think that I guess a good place to start is, we have our ideas and our experiences, and that's where we draw our ideas from, and they're not necessarily the same for everybody else. It's interesting, we've had, run of the mill sort of, garden variety ghost hunters say, well, I didn't really care for your ideas because I never experienced them, and then I started thinking about it differently, and then I started experiencing them.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where it's just kind of how we've experienced things. So it's doing our best to articulate it. So it's just how it's come across. Now the question that's been posed is, I think it's important to note that we only have 5 minutes left. So I'm just going to make my thought very quick, which is you gotta keep it simple, right? And one really important thing that I learned over the last year or so in learning a lot about ancient cosmology, from whether it was the Middle East or Europe or the Mediterranean. A really important thing I learned was, there's a reason that there's not much explanation on demonology until like the Middle Ages in the West, because it didn't really matter. It was just kind of like, okay, well, they exist and who cares? They lost. like who, it doesn't matter, right? You shouldn't give more power to something that doesn't deserve it. It's kind of like, you blame something else for failings and shortcomings, and it's easier to blame an outside force than to like examine your life and try and do the best you can to improve.
Personal responsibility.
Right. So, there's such a temptation in, sort of shirking responsibility and blaming it on an outside force. But, at the end of the day, we can't control the chaos that's outside of us. We're just kind of living in it. We can't order the world around us, but what we can do is order ourselves.
Right. Let's give Peter the last word as we come to the end of the show.
Well, we've talked about so many different things here.
Yeah.
Now, I guess I have a question for you, Paul. When you're perceiving all this parasite activity, do other people standing near you sometimes perceive nothing at the same time? I'm perceiving it.
I would expect that to happen, but I don't remember it ever happening. I mean, first of all, there are very few people around when I am in these situations. I think it just creates clutter. All right. What I would usually have would be either Ben or the family that lives in the house, or whatever the situation may be. And we don't have a big team who goes in, the third deputy assistant electronics honcho and all that nonsense. It's pretty much just us. Now, in the Flatberry cases, that's different because we're, working as a team, because different people have different talents, the sound recorder or the camera person or whatever. We're trying to do the UFO expert, that sort of thing. So, but I think we're really going to have to call it here. February 27th is our next open line show, and we're going to transfer, any questions that we've had today to that show and continue from there. So let's get to our announcements. Ben, if you would.
Yes. So we have a couple of things coming up to and including, once I flip this page over, we're looking forward to the Supernatural Bowl. That is a debate on February 4th at the Pine Bush UFO and Paranormal Museum in Pine Bush, New York, and to the New England Parafest in Kittery, Maine, which runs from April 10th to the 26th of this year. We'll provide more details as those dates approach.
And Peter, just very quickly, give us your website. I mean, your show, your own podcast. People would love to see it.
Sure. YouTube. Go to Shadowy Spectrums. shadowy with a Y.
Okay. And what's next week, Ben?
So next week we have on January 16th, Michael Anthony Gagliardari will tell us what it was like to grow up with the devil.
That'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't think we have time for our...
We do have time for the quote.
Okay, from the great Irish playwright and activist George Bernard Shaw, science never solves a problem without creating 10 more. I remind you that he promoted eugenics and opposed vaccination. So, anyway, I'm Paul Eno.
And I'm Ben Eno. And thanks for joining us on our
Wait, let Peter.
Oh, I'm sorry, Peter.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. And I'm Peter William Shelley. Thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey, and we'll see you next time on Behind the Paranormal.
Return to this radio frequency 100.